The worst battle in history, Stalingrad. August 23, 1942, 2 p.m. The sun hung over Stalingrad like a copper coin. Boris Kryzhanovsky was finishing his dinner. A 10-year-old boy in a city that bore the name of a dictator, a city built on pride, on propaganda, on the banks of a river that would soon run red. At 2:18, the sky turned black. Not with clouds, with aircraft. Over 600 German bombers, the largest aerial assault on a single city since the beginning of the war. The earth didn't shake, it convulsed. Buildings collapsed before the bombs even struck them. The shock wave alone was enough to shatter stone. Within 40 minutes, 40,000 civilians were dead. Boris survived. He crawled into a bomb shelter with his family. When he emerged 2 days later, his house was gone. His neighborhood was gone. The central district of Stalingrad erased. He stood in his underwear. Everything else had burned. This is where the worst battle in human history began. Not with strategy, not with honor, but with fire, and the grinding, inevitable horror that comes when two madmen decide a city must be taken or defended at any cost. This is the story of Stalingrad. Act 1. The Descent. The Battle of Stalingrad was never supposed to happen. Let that sink in. The bloodiest, most catastrophic urban battle ever fought. A battle that would claim nearly 2 million lives in just 6 months, was an afterthought, a detour, a footnote in a larger plan. Adolf Hitler's original strategy in the summer of 1942 was clear: capture the oil fields of the Caucasus. Germany was running out of fuel. The Wehrmacht, the most mechanized army on earth, was grinding to a halt. Without oil, the tanks stopped. Without oil, the planes fell from the sky. Without oil, the war was over. But Hitler couldn't resist. On July 23, 1942, he changed the plan. Army Group A would continue south toward the oil fields, but Army Group B, led by General Friedrich Paulus and his 6th Army, would be diverted. Their new objective? A city on the Volga River. A city named Stalingrad. Not because it was strategically vital, not because it controlled supply lines, but because it bore the name of Joseph Stalin. Hitler wanted to humiliate his rival. He wanted the propaganda victory. He wanted to plant the Nazi flag in Stalin's city and watch the world react. It was hubris, pure, lethal hubris. And Stalin took the bait. On July 28th, just days after Hitler issued his orders, Stalin issued his own, Order 227, not one step back. Every meter of Soviet soil must be defended to the last drop of blood. Retreat was treason. Cowardice was death. He also made another decision. He refused to evacuate the civilians. 400,000 people lived in Stalingrad, men, women, children. Stalin believed the Red Army would fight harder if they were defending a living city, if they could hear the screams of the civilians behind them, if they knew that surrender meant leaving families to the mercy of the Wehrmacht. So the civilians stayed. And when the German 6th Army arrived on August 23rd, they stayed in a city that was about to become hell on earth.
Act 2. The Grinder. By the way, if you're liking my content, consider subscribing for more action-packed stories. Let's continue. General Paulus ordered a massive aerial bombardment. It lasted 2 days. When it was over, Stalingrad was unrecognizable. Entire districts had been reduced to rubble. The Volga River was choked with bodies. Oil tanks along the riverbanks had been hit, and the water itself was on fire, a sheet of flame stretching across the current. Valentina Savelyeva, a civilian girl, watched from a burrow near the river. Her family had been scavenging for potatoes when the bombs fell. They hid, peering out as the world burned. The Volga was a sheet of fire, she later recalled. We crouched in the burrow, peeping out. The potatoes lasted a week. When the incendiary bombs fell, we would rush out and cook them on the flames. When the potatoes ran out, they ate clay from the riverbank. It was slightly sweet, Valentina said. I would suck on it all day long. My mother collected water from the Volga. There was blood floating downstream. This was life in Stalingrad now. Civilians trapped in a war zone. Children eating clay to survive. Families camping in the ruins, cooking over the flames of their burning city. But the bombing was just the beginning. After the Luftwaffe came the panzers. After the panzers came the infantry. The German 6th Army pushed into the city, expecting to sweep through the rubble in a matter of days. They were wrong. Stalingrad was a narrow city, built along the Volga. Streets were choked with debris, buildings had collapsed into impassable barriers, and the Soviet defenders used every inch of it. The Red Army fought with a tactic they called hugging. Stay as close to the German lines as possible, so close that the Luftwaffe couldn't bomb without hitting their own troops, so close that artillery was useless, so close that every battle became hand-to-hand. The panzers, those gleaming symbols of German blitzkrieg, became death traps. Soviet soldiers dropped Molotov cocktails from rooftops. They fired from basement windows. They lured tanks into narrow streets and destroyed them with grenades. Urban warfare, the great equalizer. And it was absolute hell. Act 3, the abyss. Buildings changed hands dozens of times. Not streets, not blocks, buildings. Individual structures became battlefields that lasted for weeks. Entire companies, hundreds of men would be destroyed just to capture a single floor. And then the enemy would counterattack and it would start all over again. There was Pavlov's house, a 4-story apartment building that became a fortress. Soviet Sergeant Yakov Pavlov and a handful of soldiers held it for 58 days against constant German assault. They turned every window into a firing position, every room into a bunker. The Germans threw everything at it, grenades, flamethrowers, artillery, but Pavlov held. There was the grain elevator, a massive concrete structure on the edge of the city. For 5 days, a single Soviet platoon defended it against an entire German regiment. When it finally fell, only a handful of Soviet soldiers were left alive. They had fought, literally, to the last man. There was the Red October Steel Factory, the Barakati Arms Factory, the Stalingrad Tractor Factory. Giant industrial complexes that became urban fortresses. The fighting there was so intense, so unimaginably brutal that German officers later described it as worse than anything they had experienced in the entire war. One German officer wrote in a letter found on his body, "We must reach the Volga. We can see it, less than a kilometer away. We have the constant support of our aircraft and artillery. We are fighting like madmen, but cannot reach the river." The whole war for France was shorter than the fight for one Volga factory. We must be up against suicide squads. They have simply decided to fight to the last soldier. And how many soldiers are left over there? When will this hell come to an end? Historian David Glantz later noted that the battle resembled the fighting on the Somme and at Verdun in 1916 more than the familiar Blitzkrieg War. World War I had returned. Trench warfare, attrition, grinding, senseless slaughter in the mud and rubble. But Stalingrad was worse. Because in Stalingrad, there were no trenches, no open fields, just the ruins of a city. Just buildings where the same floors were occupied by German and Soviet soldiers firing at each other through holes in the ceiling. Soviet sniper Vasily Chechov later described the psychological shift he experienced. He said, "The first time I killed a German, I felt terrible. I had killed a human being." But after time, after seeing what the Germans had done to his country, he said, "I started to mercilessly fire on them. I've become a barbaric person. I kill them. I hate them." This is what Stalingrad did. It turned men into killers. It turned cities into graves.
Act 4. The Trap. By October 1942, the Germans controlled 90% of Stalingrad. They were 200 yards from the Volga. Victory seemed inevitable. General Paulus requested reinforcements for one final push, but Hitler had made a mistake, a catastrophic one. He had committed the entire Sixth Army, over 300,000 men, to capturing a city, and in doing so, he had stretched his flanks thin. The northern and southern approaches to Stalingrad were defended by Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian troops, poorly equipped, poorly trained, poorly motivated. Soviet General Georgy Zhukov saw the opportunity. He had been quietly amassing forces on either side of the city, fresh divisions, tanks, artillery. Everything the Germans didn't know was coming. On November 19, 1942, Zhukov launched Operation Uranus, a massive two-pronged assault, from the north, from the south. The Romanian and Hungarian lines collapsed within hours. The Soviet pincers drove deep into the German rear, cutting off supply lines, encircling entire divisions. And then, on November 23rd, the pincers closed. The German Sixth Army was trapped. 300,000 soldiers sealed inside a pocket, surrounded by the Red Army. No escape, no reinforcements, no hope. They called it the Kessel, the Cauldron. And inside that cauldron, the real horror began. By the way, if you're liking my content, consider subscribing for more action-packed stories. Let's continue. Act 5. The Kessel. Winter came early that year, the worst Russian winter in half a century. Temperatures plunged to 30 degrees below zero. The Sixth Army was not prepared. They had no winter clothing, no fuel for heating, no shelter except the ruins of buildings that offered no protection from the cold, and they were starving. The Luftwaffe attempted to resupply the pocket by air. Hermann Göring promised Hitler that his planes could deliver 500 tons of supplies per day. They never came close. On most days, they delivered less than 100 tons, and much of it was useless. Summer uniforms, propaganda pamphlets, champagne for the officers. The soldiers ate their horses. Then they ate the leather from their boots. Then they ate nothing. Thousands died from starvation, thousands more from frostbite. Medical supplies ran out. Hospitals overflowed with wounded men lying in corridors, in hallways, in the basements of ruined buildings, waiting to die. Andreas Engel, a German sergeant, later described the scene at the airfield where soldiers desperate to escape would storm the planes. He wrote, "The crowd here was unimaginable. My hopes sank to zero. Next morning an aircraft came. At gunpoint, the crew stopped the machine from being stormed. He was one of the lucky ones. He was wounded. He couldn't walk, and so he was given priority. Wrapped in a paper sack to insulate him from the cold, he was loaded onto the plane and flown out. When he landed, an officer made him sign a document, a Führer order. He was forbidden to speak about what he had seen, forbidden to tell anyone about the conditions in the Kessel. The German people would never know, not until it was too late." Act 6. The End. General Paulus wanted to break out, to fight his way through the Soviet lines, to save his army. But Hitler refused. "The Sixth Army will hold its position to the last man," Hitler ordered. "Surrender is forbidden." And so they stayed, and they died. On January 30, 1943, Hitler promoted Paulus to field marshal. It was a symbolic gesture. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. Hitler expected Paulus to commit suicide rather than face the dishonor of capture. But Paulus didn't. On February 2, 1943, gaunt, dysentery-ridden, his face disfigured by a nervous tic, he surrendered to Soviet General Mikhail Shumelov. 91,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner. They were all that remained of the 300,000 who had been trapped in the Kessel. Only 6,000 of them ever made it home. The rest died in Soviet prison camps, starved, frozen, worked to death in the Siberian mines. The same fate
they had inflicted on Soviet prisoners. And the Soviet casualties? Over 750,000 soldiers dead, another 1.1 million wounded, and 40,000 civilians killed in the initial bombing alone. Estimates for total civilian deaths range from 40,000 to 60,000. Many more died from starvation, disease, and exposure. In total, nearly 2 million people died in the Battle of Stalingrad. More than in the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. More than in any single battle in human history. By the way, if you're liking my content, consider subscribing for more action-packed stories. Let's continue. Act 7. The Silence. After the battle, the civilians who survived were forgotten. The Soviet government constructed a narrative. Stalingrad had been a fortress, a symbol of Soviet resilience. The soldiers had defended it to the last breath. It was a story of heroism, of sacrifice, of victory. There was no room in that story for civilians. As many as 500,000 civilians had remained in Stalingrad when the battle began. Those who survived the initial onslaught were trapped in a living nightmare. They lived in basements, in bomb shelters, in the ruins. They watched as their city was destroyed, building by building, street by street. And when the battle ended, they were told to be silent. The government delayed evacuation measures. Stalin himself reportedly forbade evacuations, declaring that soldiers do not fight for empty cities. The civilians were bait. They were hostages. They were tools to motivate the Red Army. And when the war ended, they were erased. Children who had survived Stalingrad were ostracized. They couldn't join the Communist Youth League. They couldn't wear the red kerchiefs of the young pioneers. They were tainted, suspect. Anyone who had been in occupied territory was viewed with suspicion. Parents forbid their children to speak about what they had endured. For half a century, the civilian survivors of Stalingrad lived in silence, afraid to recall their experiences, afraid that their stories would contradict the official narrative. It wasn't until the fall of the Soviet Union that they could finally speak. Valentina Savelyeva, who ate clay by the Volga and watched blood float downstream, finally told her story. Boris Kryzhanovsky, who stood in his underwear in the ruins of his home, finally told his story. They had lived through the worst battle in history, and for half a century, no one wanted to hear it. By the way, if you're liking my content, consider subscribing for more action-packed stories. Let's continue. Closing. The turning point. Stalingrad changed everything. Militarily, it was the turning point of World War II on the Eastern Front. The German army never recovered. The myth of Nazi invincibility was shattered. The Sixth Army, one of the most elite formations in the Wehrmacht, was gone, destroyed, and with it went any hope Hitler had of victory in the East. But Stalingrad was more than a military defeat. It was a moral reckoning. The battle revealed the true nature of total war, the industrial-scale slaughter, the complete disregard for human life, the willingness of dictators, Hitler and Stalin, to feed men, women, and children into the meat grinder for the sake of pride, propaganda, and power. Both sides committed atrocities. Both sides showed extraordinary courage, and both sides suffered losses that defy comprehension. On February 2nd, 1993, 50 years after the battle ended, German and Soviet veterans met in Volgograd. The city had been renamed after Stalin's death. The old enemies embraced. They wept. They traded stories. Gerhard Dingler, a German artillery captain, was 70 years old. He had been captured at Stalingrad and spent years in a Soviet prison camp. Everybody has hugged me. Nobody has cursed us for being Germans. It's unforgettable, he said. Fritz Pendel, a German doctor, spoke fluent Russian from his time as a prisoner. I never experienced hate from the Russians. They had a lot of understanding for us, he said. And on the Soviet side, Yakov Kiselev, wounded 4 times during the battle, lived in a rundown retirement home. He received a pension of 900 rubles per month, about $1.50, enough to buy a kilogram of bad sausage or 3 packs of cigarettes. This was the legacy of Stalingrad. The victors lived in poverty. The survivors carried scars that never healed. And the dead, nearly 2 million of them, remained buried in the ruins of a city that no longer existed. Today, a massive statue stands in Volgograd. It's called The Motherland Calls, an 85-meter-tall woman holding a sword aloft, calling her children to battle. It is the tallest statue in Europe, a monument to sacrifice, to suffering, to the worst battle in human history. And if you stand at the base of that statue and listen, you can almost hear them, the voices of the dead, the soldiers who fought building by building, floor by floor, until nothing remained but rubble and ghosts. The civilians who ate clay by the Volga and watched blood float downstream. The men who starved in the Kessel, waiting for rescue that never came. Stalingrad was not inevitable. It was the product of 2 men's hubris, 2 dictators who turned a city into a symbol, who sacrificed millions for pride, who proved that in war there are no winners, only survivors, and sometimes not even that. End. Total word count 3,045.